Hey, I'm Dan Goodman, one of the first, possibly the first, assistant organizers. And introduce.
My name is Margaret Taylor, and Dan and I sort of spearheaded this workshop today. It's going to be sort of I'm also a newly made assistant organizer. It's going to be sort of a hybrid of panel discussion and sort of a roundtable discussion. We've got Rebecca Chesson? Yes, Rebecca Chesson is a psychologist, and Dan and I can both talk about our personal experiences. We both have synesthesia, and I'm also face blind. We're going to be talking about writing characters with minds different from mine. So how do you get into the frame of it when you have to write about a really exotic character?
Margaret?
Yes?
What is face blind?
I am really bad at recognizing people's faces.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, and let's see, one thing I will say to begin with is it's not strange from the inside. This isn't always true, but, for example, but to me, being right-handed is exotic. And to most right-handed people never think about it.
Well, I don't know about you, but I feel strange all the time.
Okay, well, yeah, but as I say, it's not everybody, but but certainly there are men who write about women under the impression that women think about being women all the time.
That's true. I think that whatever our experience is, we accept that as normal. That's the baseline, and that's why we have the kind of judgment and criticism where it does exist in between people in relationships, is because my logic for how to keep the kitchen clean is different than, for example, my husband's, and his way is totally wrong. Right?
Okay, yeah, I mean, certainly with synesthesia, some people find out that everybody else, not everybody else has synesthesia when they first start to talk, and people start looking at them weird when they talk about the colors of music and such, and other people. I heard about one. I remember I've seen on a mailing list somebody who was around 60. He was a mathematician until he was around 60. He took for granted that all of his colleagues, just like him, use synesthesia in their work.
Well, to start off, maybe we should define that. Okay,
synesthesia is sensations besides the primary one. One of the more relatively common ones is seeing sounds. There are also various, there are umpteen others, other kinds. I mean, some of them fairly rare, but
one that is common is seeing abstract concepts or symbols like letters and numbers as having a color associated with them. A little less common is having like a personality associated with them, like, number 7 is very aggressive or something. There's sound to touch associations, sound to taste, I think. I don't think it goes in the other direction very often, but just about every combination of senses you can think of, there's somebody there who experiences that. They're just sort of tied to each other in your everyday experience, and you cannot disentangle them apart.
I can I can untangle them if I take when I used to take psychedelic drugs safely beyond the statute of limitations. My synesthesia went away.
Really?
Really.
Many people have the opposite drug. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That's why most people take them.
Yes, and it's. By the way, I did not realize I had any kind of synesthesia till I was around 17, when somebody asked me if I could see the music that was playing on the record player, and I realized I could.
So I have a question. Do you both write?
Yes.
We're here in MinSpec, so yes.
Okay. And so how has your personal experience with synesthesia helped you get into the mind of an other to write about it believably?
The answer is, for me, it hasn't worked well at all. I haven't been able to figure out a way to use it for that.
For me, synesthesia, not really at all, because it's just not a big deal. It's just, I have the letters to colors version. And it's just like, okay, letters are colored, and that really doesn't matter very much. But what I found is more helpful is just reading a lot. And reading a lot of good stuff where other writers put you in the heads of many, many different people. And you get used to that idea of, being somebody else. And then, once you've seen watch the master do it, then you can try your hand at it yourself. Actually, that brings me to an interesting question that I could ask. Maybe we can go around the table if anybody has an idea. What's the most interesting, strangest character you've ever read about, and how did the author do that?
Okay, well, the most interesting one I've read about was the Russian guy who remembered everything. He also had synesthesia, but he remembered everything he had ever heard, ever read, ever seen.
Right, there are people like that that don't have synesthesia, and it's really hard to live with that.
Yeah, his mind was kind of crowded.
Didn't he eventually go mad?
No, although he didn't. He was never entirely sane, but I don't recall that he went crazy.
I read a book from the point of view of a search engine once. She was an AI who was being housed in some building in Palo Alto, I don't know where, and she was supposed to be, a very intelligent search engine, and that's how she eventually wound up sapient. And it was very interesting. The lady is ordinarily a mystery writer, and Donna Andrews, it was called You've Got Murder, and I think somebody in the company gets killed, and the search engine has all her lovely internet capabilities and eventually figures out who did it. But it was very interesting for the writer to describe what that's like. Her experience was mainly composed of the internet pages that she could get at.
It's
So,
interesting to consider non-human characters because
Because
regardless
this is
of one's
spec-fic.
perceptual apparatus, I mean the basic human motivations don't vary all that much.
There's
pretty famous Ray Bradbury short story whose title I can't remember right now. That's told from the point of view of not actually a sentient house, but an active one. It's set in the future, and the house has this. Essentially, it's got robots and like little cleaning things, and it's got this sort of network of programs and protocols, but it doesn't show any signs of being precisely intelligent. But there are no living things in the story. It's just about this house that keeps going on doing all of the things that it's supposed to do after all the humans have died, and it's a fascinating story. It's really good. Well, it's Ray Bradbury. I know it's famous. I just can't remember the title.
There Will Come Soft Rains. I think that was it.
Yeah, that might be it.
Pinocchio is kind of an interesting character because here's a block of wood that has been given the opportunity to live. It has no perception of what that is or what frame of reference to use. And I think that's basically what the story's based on.
And I've read the actual original fairy tale, Carlo Collodi. He takes great liberties with the whole block of wood idea. So Pinocchio has things like he needs to eat for some reason. And he never explains why. And then, that episode is over and then we just move right on and no explanation ever given.
And taking off from Pinocchio, there's always data on Star Trek Next Generation. And I've never really understood that motivation to want to be more like humans. I mean, why does everyone want to be like a human? Why can't they just be who they are?
They don't know any better.
Maybe because Star Trek writers are all human.
Well,
Yeah.
that's
As far as we know, and I used to know David Gerald, and
Are you saying you have your doubts about
What?
David Gerald?
Dude, have you read
there
Orient
is room
before?
for doubt.
Because there is question.
Yeah, why don't we go back? There's a story, it might have been an analog, and I don't remember the title. An investigator comes in, looks human, but as soon as the person gets onto the world, completely transforms into a different type of character. So the character can survive in this very inhospitable world, physically inhospitable. Is that person still human, or is it something else? And it solves a mystery about why nasty things are happening. So in a sense, the setup is a mystery. There was another story, and I forgot what it was. But that's talking about we see ourselves as we physically are, and not as we can be transformed into to do the work of the story. It's like Philip K. Dick's in, I can't remember the story, when the guy rises up to the ceiling and explodes. If you want to talk about someone who's playing with your concepts of reality, read Philip K. Dick. Like it's Uma or something like that. I forgot the exact title. And you really come to question what is reality and who's living in the ultimate reality, because it's not clear at all.
One of the short stories that sticks in my head is the story of a girl who was raised to be a goddess. She was raised to be an avatar of the goddess Kali, and that ends when they hit their menstrual period, but it's accentuated by computing power. It's an SF story. And so basically, what is it like to be a fallen goddess? She does not think of herself as human. She does not interact with other people as human. And the story goes into that in really interesting ways, and also her future career as an artificial intelligence smuggler changes the end of the story because of the way it meshes with her and the way her brain works.
Okay, I recommend Hal Clement's Ice World. Essentially, the main character is a detective who is tracking down the source of a drug, and he ends up finding on an inhabited planet which is so cold that sulfur is a solid.
What?
Sulfur is a solid.
What?
Sulfur is a
Sulfur
solid.
is a solid.
Sulfur
What?
is a solid.
Sulfur is a solid.
Not on any planet he's familiar with.
Oh, okay.
And the planet, the drug, by the way, is called tobacco.
Is he an
And-
alien?
What?
Is he an alien?
Yes.
Oh. So then that would be looking at us through an altered lens.
Mm.
I think one of the challenges with non-human characters is to make their differences consistent with their different worldview. I mean that we all live in the same universe, or like 98% of us do, and we're subject to the same physical laws, and so any life form is going to have certain priorities that they're going to have to attend to, and we know that they do because they're still here. And so there are certain constant, certain basics that you have to deal with, but how you deal with them, I think, depends very much on what your circumstances are, what your upbringing is, perhaps your perceptual capabilities, and all of this. And you have to, as a writer, I think, put your mind into that situation and say, well, you know, here's an attribute that this entity has. What is its consequence in terms of the way that it lives its life?
And how do you make your readers empathize with that character? Because they could be different, but if they're too different, you'll have no idea what's going on. Like, what if you're going to write about some sort of crystalline being that is on the planet XYZ and can't move? And what if it doesn't want anything? How do you write about that?
And you can't do a Vulcan mind meld with it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. There is. Let's say in Clifford Simak's Time is the Simplest Thing. The protagonist encounters an alien who greets him with, "I trade with you my mind," and he is instantly given the entire contents of this being's mind, along with the minds of with all of the information from all the other beings the alien has encountered.
So cumulative mind.
Yes, and it takes let's just say it, among other problems, it takes a while for him to sort out what he's been given, because this alien was a pack rat. By the way,
Non-discriminating pack rat who did sort out his memories.
yeah, and
Some of us are like that.
okay, by the way, of course, there are people who are, for dealing with other kind of humans, there are people who know exactly how all humans think. Aristotle, for example, knew that thinking is done in words. But there are people who think in pictures, there are people who think in various and Einstein, at least part of the time, thought in synesthesia form.
He thought in like moving picture, then tried to
Yeah,
explain.
and a fair amount of my thinking is in sort of mostly tactile, but also partly visual diagrams, sometimes in 4 dimensions, which
that has something to do with modes of learning. Lots of people are good at taking in information by reading it. Some people are better at
Hearing.
hearing it or seeing a diagram or talking to a person to learn it. And it's a really ineffable difference. I have a coworker who's an auditory learner. So she studies by gathering together a bunch of friends, and they all talk about the subject matter together until it all clicks. Which, you know, if I tried to do that, that would be a bizarre way to study. It's just, no, give me a book and a couple hours quiet. But it works.
Yeah, it's one piece of advice Peter Drucker gave to to people in organizations was, for God's sakes, find out how your boss absorbs information. And because otherwise you're giving an auditory learner who's and all these wonderful diagrams.
That's assuming, of course, that your boss does absorb information.
Yeah, we're leaving politics out of it.
Well, one of the most basic problems I think we have as writers is men writing women and women writing men. Because I read books that are on the bestseller list where the author has really fallen short in a lot of places. And I think, I wouldn't have said that, you know? And in fact, I critiqued one time where someone said, the man's part of the conversation was, what do you think? And if I really feel like we should, they said, no, men don't think like that, women think like that. But when I'm trying to write a man, I like to read things written by men because that helps me bridge that. They write differently, you know, especially the very few romance writers that are out there. The way a man writes a romance book and the way a woman writes it are two totally different things. So, you know, does anybody else have problems with men writing women, women writing men?
Really good writers can make the transition.
Oh.
And what they do is they ask people of the opposite sex to meet the section.
Yeah, that helps too.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the back.
Oh, one thing that I've encountered that, you know, it's maybe people think about this less than genders. I've noticed sometimes that there's a little bit of a disconnect when people of one sexual orientation write as characters of a different one. There's a series that I like quite a bit where the author is gay and the main character though is heterosexual, and you know, most of the time it doesn't you know, bother me, but when he tries to write the female love interest of the main character, it just seems like, well, that's not the things that any straight men I know would say about an attractive woman.
I think that there's a risk here. Well, I mean, our task as writers is to have a diversity of characters. So we don't want to have all of the characters be like ourselves, but there's definitely a risk here of stereotyping, of overgeneralizing. Not all straight men are alike.
Right.
Not all straight women are alike. And
There are people who are into S&M and who are absolutely certain that everybody else is. The people who say they aren't are lying are lying to themselves or
We're gonna teach
to
them
everyone
the right
else.
way.
Right.
What?
And they're gonna teach them the right way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've read stuff by and for a number of different, permutations, and I'm not saying that a gay man can't write as a straight man. I just think that some of them do it better than others. So when I'm saying that I notice that there's something off, I'm not saying that that's true of, because the best writers are the ones who can pretend to be the most people.
Yeah, just a comment. In the Writer magazine, they had someone who says he was transcribing tapes or stuff, and that's how he developed his ability to do dialogue, is by transcribing many different types of people. That's a variation on what August Wilson would do, is go to a cafe and take notes on what people said.
That's
Trying not to be too obvious.
Observation.
That's actual research.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We were in a restaurant last week, and some people at the other table were having an interesting conversation. My wife said, "I thought you were going to take your notebook out and take notes."
You have to start with the notebook out because people look at you a little funny when you take it out afterwards.
Let's see, which brings up something else, which is getting what other people, getting what people who speak differently from you do right. I mean, there are some English SF writers do interesting things with American dialogue, and these are in novels that are published in the U.S. Lord knows what there was back when they before the editor and copy editor took out the really obvious mistakes in American dialogue. There are people have there are sounds in some that people can't hear in other dialogues. For example, people who pronounce Don and Dawn exactly the same have trouble hearing the difference when other people don't.
I can give you a couple of examples, and it's right here in Minnesota. I say Mary, 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 and there's a third one, all different.
Mary.
Mary. People here say them all the same.
Yeah, and
I can't hear the difference.
Yeah.
The third one, I heard the difference. The first two, I would have to really practice.
Yeah, and there are people who pronounce two of the three not differently, same.
Anyway, well, that can lead to a lot of interesting confusion in a conversation. My wife was teaching at a school in where was it? Reading, Massachusetts, and some kids who she had as she was a speech clinician there, and they asked her, "Can we go play dots?" And half an hour later, one of the people said, "They're playing dots." Yeah, no, connect the dots. No, dots.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and
But those are regionalisms. There's plenty of books on that stuff. And there's plenty
yeah,
of
but there's plenty of books on that stuff, and there are recordings for actors who need to put on dialect, but they don't always work.
Well, you get a dialect coach.
What? Yeah, I mean, but I gather that, for example, that Dick Van Dyke's British British accent was not very convincing to the English, and
I want to speak about that in stereotypes because I think that we're a lot of the discussion is taking an egocentric perspective, in that I can read something and say, a woman would never say that, and check, and it's a male author, and I feel vindicated in making that judgment. I mean,
Right.
stereotypes are useful because there's a kernel of truth to them, but we can extrapolate them too far. And I am not at all persuaded that there was something about it that triggered me and seemed unbelievable. But I bet you I could go out there and transcribe a bunch of conversations and give them to you and say which are made up and which were real people talking.
Yeah.
And I bet you people would be fooled and say, oh, a man would never say that. Oh, a black person would never say that. Oh,
Right.
someone from Alpha Centauri would never say that.
That was
And-
made up.
Really, or is that your own personal bias?
Maybe it was chance.
Got some contacts I don't know about.
Half the time, I cannot tell the gender of a writer of, for example, of a newspaper article where maybe
Right.
the author's name is hard to find, and I'm writing halfway through and wait, is this person a man or a woman? And then I go look up for the the author's name, and half the time I'm wrong. So I think that
Because they have editors
yeah.
that filter everything.
That too, and but I think it also points to a certain a commonality, because men and women both think like humans, so that's something you can start from when you have to write somebody of the opposite gender.
Let's see, according to Aristotle, a woman is a kind of inferior man.
But actually,
Product of
you know
his
what?
times.
That's
What?
not true, because in the womb, when a male fetus is developing, because they're XY, there's evidently this enzyme wash that that basically men are brain damaged women.
Well,
all making sense.
well, let's see, Aristotle.
Not that I've got a horse in the race.
And okay, another regional thing, by the way, there are, let's see, I used to work with people who were, I used to work for the Forest Service, and to some of the people there, if you mentioned Manhattan, they assumed you meant Manhattan, Kansas. And there was a Hong Kong style Chinese restaurant which was originally named the Aberdeen Restaurant, with Aberdeen being a suburb of Hong Kong. But to most people in this area, there were probably people who looked at the name of the restaurant and said, no, I don't want South Dakota cuisine.
Aberdeen's part of
Scotland.
British.
What?
Yeah, it's part of Great Britain.
Yeah, I
Yes.
thought it was.
Oh yeah. Well, it's also part of the original one, but after which the other two were named. But
It's Scotland.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I would say that it helps to be aware of the stereotypes that people will expect from characters of a certain type, so that if you go too far away from what they're expecting, you know to lay the groundwork so that they understand that this is coming from the character, this is true to the character. It's not contradicting women talk all the time, because you've built up that this is a woman who does not talk all the time.
Right.
And even though it's annoying to have to do that in fiction, it can really help. And for the record, about a quarter of the time people think I'm a man when I'm writing. So,
Can I ask
That's a good
something?
point. Consistency.
Most-
is-
like I've gotten a lot of
Phone.
Mr.
Yeah.
Raweeby
have,
responses. So,
A unique opportunity to show us, like in stereo perspective, what it's like for you to have synesthesia, and what it's like for him to have it. And it's obviously different and unique to each person. And I was wondering if you would spend a little time explaining how you deal with it and what it looks like to you.
And have you written about it?
And does it affect your writing itself? I mean, if colors for you, if word, letters, and stuff equate to colors, how does that affect what you read?
It doesn't affect my my writing or my reading. Letters do have a pretty strong color sensation, but it's easy to get past it and just get into the meaning of the words. What I do find the effect that it has is it helps me do math and remember numbers, because numbers have colors associated with them. So I know, like, for example, my home address, 2201, that's a very blue and white. It's like this icy blue landscape looking number, and that's how I recall it. And fortunately, it's also very pretty, so I like my address.
Okay, yeah.
That's the kind of thing I wanted to know.
Is there a,
It seems
Yeah,
like
there
if you would
is-
see colors all the time,
Is there a
the world would be
whiteboard
such a prettier place, you know?
Yeah.
Some
It would be an elevator,
that's why
sort of.
I really like the letter E, because it's this sort of grayish green, not quite jade. It's like grayer than that, but that's why E is my favorite letter.
Maybe not.
Okay, if I want to remember an address, I write it down, and I remember. I have the tactile memory of writing it down.
There's pepper.
No whiteboard markers.
Pepper.
I don't
That's
think
too
Pepper
bad.
makes a dark enough
I was
mark.
staring at that for a while, but
I took my writing book out of here, so I don't have any markers.
Anyway,
Oh well.
I think that people use what we call multimodality learning, that I can hear things, sometimes I can remember it. If I take notes, I remember it better. And my daughter said something to me, says, I think I have attention deficit disorder because when I take notes, I write down everything literally. And I realize I do the same thing. I have attention deficit disorder. You can walk into my house and you see the piles of things. No flat surface is safe. And that's a good sign for attention deficit disorder. But so I have multimodality learning for math and other stuff. I have to learn, things have to pass a threshold of exposure. Until I get to that threshold, I don't know it. Once I hit the threshold, I know it fairly well. So it's, if I was talking mathematically, I would say, it's like a Dirac delta, but no one here's going to know what I'm talking about. And that has two values, 0 and 1. So it's either on or it's off.
Oh, binary.
Well, it's below a certain value it's 0, and above a certain value it's 1. And that's called the Dirac delta, and it's used in physics. It's a useful concept to do that. And I had one other comment. Is there are languages that are really different. Edward St. Pierre said that, I think it was Navajo, they see the world differently. They had no trouble with calculus. They would have trouble with regular arithmetic because their language as they spoke, used a continuum. Now, he may be quite wrong, and some people say he is, but they didn't have the word is. They don't have the word is. Hebrew doesn't have the word is, doesn't have the verb to be. Both languages developed, and I don't know about the other Semitic languages, but languages are developed in a ever-changing environment, like a desert, are different than languages that develop where everything is static. So you would see something like the base of whatever Egyptian was, since it was a cycle, round and round, you have a different concept of the way the world works than people that lived in the nearby desert, because everything was always changing. And Mach, there's a book that someone who's a German philosopher talks about that, and I want to say it's Ernst Mach, but it's not. But he talked about how our modern concept of time, of the continuous flow, comes from the way we create language. And our language reflects the environment that we live in. That affects the way we tell stories.
So I have a question. If you see letters as colors, does that affect how you write because you're basically painting with the words that you write? Do you ever look at it that way, or?
Most of the time, the words are just the meaning of the word, but I suppose I keep track of characters in a sort of color-coded way. Like I was working on a story that probably many of you saw last year when I was going through Crit, there were 3 storylines with a point of view character named Alec and Bobbin and Ms. Walker. So there would be a yellow plot thread going through it because A is sort of like a school bus yellow, and a blue thread through the plot because of the letter B, and W is sort of a gray shade, so then that would be the gray plot thread, and that's how I visualize how these 3 threads sort of weave together in the narrative of the story. It sort of helps to organize.
Color coding.
Yeah. They're sort of automatically color-coded.
So, if you read a novel that you like, do you try to emulate the colors of that novel when you write?
No, not really.
Okay.
Okay. I understand that people who see colored letters do so only with languages they know. Does that-
Yes, but if I, for example, Greek letters, if I know what the letter means, like beta, I know that was sort of that's sort of like a relative of the letter B, then beta becomes B colored. If I think of it as a sort of a weird looking B. Mu, like Muse kind of looks like that. If I think about it like a curly U, because it kind of looks like a U, it's gray. But it's actually a relative of the letter M. So if I think of it, oh, it's a relative of M, then it's sort of a dark red because that's what color M is. So it has more to do with what the letter means than what it looks like.
Okay, okay, what about languages using our alphabet?
I see the letters as what their English equivalents. Like Cyrillic, it's got that backwards N. It looks like an N, even though it's actually a vowel in Russian.
Because from what I've read, it's apparently more common that if you don't know German, for example, you don't, and you see English for letters in English in colors, you won't see the German letters in colors, but apparently but there are always exceptions.
It would be a bunch of familiar letters arranged in an order for all these unfamiliar words, and I don't know what the words mean, but the letters would be perfectly familiar. I try and apply an English language interpretation to it, even though the words are gibberish.
Do you have any idea how many colors you see? Like, is it 21 or 26? Is it one for each letter in the alphabet, or are there different shades of the colors? Like, if you see a B one time and it's in a particular context, is that letter slightly a different color the next time you see a B in a different context?
For any particular letter, the letter B, for example, is always exactly the same.
Always exactly the same color.
And it can be like a big B, it can be a curly B, but as long as it means B. I mean, if I write this and I pretend like it's an upside down B, then it's B colored.
So there'd be like 26 of them?
Except that there's a lot of orange letters.
A lot of different colors of orange?
Yeah, slightly different, but it's kind of hard to tell the difference.
And if you're colorblind, that would be
Yeah.
So then do words take on colors based on the letters in them?
Sometimes they look like their initial letter.
Yeah.
But that's pretty faint.
You have to learn to see past the colors.
Yeah.
When you've done it so long, I mean, that's like how you always see it.
Yeah, I thought everybody did this until I was 12 and I read an article in Discover magazine about synesthesia. It's like, oh, everybody else doesn't do that. That's weird.
Yeah, a lot of people find out about this when in college. Why is the psychology instructor talking about this as if it's something weird?
When I was a little kid, I didn't understand why everybody else seemed to recognize me. How do these people know each other on sight? Like, I must have a very strange hairdo because I see everybody as a different hairdo That's how I figure out who you are.
Well, you must have a real hard time when people cut their hair.
Oh my
change it up.
God, yes. This has happened. Like, I've got a coworker, he used to have, sort of short hair. He shaved it one time. I came into work and I was like, Vi? Oh my gosh, your hair is gone. I figured it out after a few seconds, but it was embarrassing.
Not too much different than people who look at someone and they don't associate the name with the face and they don't use a memory system to do it. And, they're people, you just don't remember who they are. They're vaguely familiar, but you're not sure where you're familiar with them. A lot of people have that problem.
I have trouble with pairs of people sometimes. Like if I meet two people who are totally different, but I meet them in the same circumstances and I learn those two names, I don't remember which name goes with which person.
I have a pair of friends from college. I met them on this. They walked into the room and were introduced at the same time.
Yeah.
It took me more than 5 years before I could reliably use the
There
right name
are
of the
two
right
women
person.
at my bank, and I've been there for like 40 years. And I hope they retire.
That'll solve the
I
problem.
never remember which is which.
But there are memory systems that you can use to get over that by telling a story about someone's face and then you associate the story with the name.
I have to consciously do that to remember which.
Has anybody else
other
seen
context?
the National Geographic show Brain Games? If you're interested in this sort of thing, it's quite a bit of fun. They talk about all sorts of different aspects of learning and visual illusions and all
Are you
sorts of
talking
stuff
about
like
not
that.
knowing how other people think? When I was a kid, I thought, I didn't know why I was the only one who had trouble telling B's from D's, in small letters, and P's, and, even now I don't like handwriting, I like typing because I hate scribbling out when the stick goes the wrong direction.
I actually do that even when I'm typing. A lot. It's really frustrating.
I get the hands different, but so I had to associate B's with flats in music. I learned music flats the same time I learned B's, But I didn't know why everybody else had such an easy time of it.
I don't.
Oh, well.
I still mix B and P up.
Yeah, I have to think about it.
One funny thing that they always say that people aren't supposed to see both versions of an optical illusion at the same time, and I can. I also, if I concentrate, I can see the patterns of dots that are only supposed to be, they're the ones you're supposed to notice if you're partly colorblind. And I passed the test because I know the right ones are obvious for like if you're not colorblind, but I can also tell because I guess I have, or I was born with unusually good vision. Now I think it's not as good anymore, so it's probably down to normal.
That has to do with how you're able to relax your eyes.
Okay, but and I do notice that my eyes focus kind of slowly. Like if I've been reading and then I look up, they take a little longer. But
that's getting older.
I wouldn't say that I have full-blown synesthesia, but one thing I have noticed is that I like bird watching, and the way different birds fly, in my head, the wing beats make a sound, even when I'm not actually hearing, but it.
Yeah, that would be synesthesia. There is also. Okay. By the way, and this a sensory thing with me, which is that I sometimes have trouble telling looking at something, telling left from right, and been known to look at a backwards clock without realizing it was all the numbers were backwards. But I found out that I can feel left from right easily. I found this out in London, getting a ride in somebody's sports car. No, he's turning the wrong way.
Well, everybody can feel which direction a car is moving. Is that what you mean? Or
No, I
something
mean,
else?
I can feel. I mean, I can't. I mean that visually I have trouble telling which way, which is left and which is right, and there are people who have trouble also feeling left from right.
I don't think that that's that unusual. People who say take a right turn and then take a left turn, you know, it's the other right. That may be fairly common. We don't align with the magnetic fields as dogs do when taking a poop, you know.
Yeah,
You know,
that too.
Yeah, well, we don't think we do, and maybe it turned out that we do. There was, by the way, there are something, I found out there are people with colors, who see, with synesthesia, who see colors which don't exist in nature.
I have not experienced that.
Yeah, I mean, it is not that usual, but there are a few people who do.
So how does this help you develop your character?
What?
How does all this help you develop your character?
Okay, well, it essentially what it does is it helps jar you out of the mindset of, oh, I know how everybody thinks, and
You could try Donald Moss's exercise. 10 things your character likes, 10 things your character doesn't like, 10 things your character will do, and 10 things your character will never do. And you can define your character that way.
Okay.
And if you want to have the character have synesthesia, you put it down and then you define before you write what the character does. You can define how your character is going to act.
Oh.
It's not that easy.
Okay, well, let's see, it is not just synesthesia. I remember, and there are a lot of, okay, people have interesting preconceptions. My grandfather once told me that his first job in the U.S. was writing business letters for a furniture factory, and you know, English was his fourth language after Hebrew, Polish, and Yiddish. So I asked him didn't he have trouble with the letter with the spelling, and he explained no. One year the instructor at his Hebrew school in Poland was somebody who was literate not only in Hebrew but in Polish, and since English and Polish are in the same use the same alphabet, obviously they're closely related, and if you can spell one, you can spell the other. For those who don't know, Polish spelling conventions are rather different than those in English.
Put all those consonants together.
Yeah, and there are people who, and there are writers who are equally confident that they know, and they know how everybody thinks. They know. They know. it, and that's it. Yeah, that's the way, and so they don't bother to find out because they already know they're certain, or they think they do.
I've got a question for the floor. What is one of the greatest writing challenges you've had to deal with by writing a character who's pretty different from you?
I've had characters that wouldn't listen to me. Talking about characters whose minds are not your own, some of my characters will, if I'm just kind of, it's when I get into the zone and I'm just writing and not stopping, and especially in dialogue, they'll say something that, why would they say that? I wouldn't say that if I were them. Clearly I'm not them. So I wonder sometimes if there's some method acting involved, if there's some kind of being the other character. I wonder if that might help people writing in, especially like aliens or something like that. Try to be the alien, find their center or whatever. To try to write more accurately in another character's head.
I wrote a robot, or a strictly programmed artificial intelligence, which proceeded according to set parameters, and yet I had to make this a sympathetic character. And I did it by finding the element that people would really empathize with and enhancing that, even in a way that was in line with their programming, which was, even though everything was against him, and he was run down and broken and not being upgraded and not having anywhere near the capabilities that he should have to do his job, he kept going and trying to do it despite all these handicaps. And that was enough that people really empathized with that character, even though it had no feelings. It was just going by instructions and programming. And that is one of the stories that I actually has done best, one of my stories. So that was good.
I have a character who is a gargoyle brought to life by he was created by a sorcerer, and he has all these memories, but he's been waiting millennia to wake up and serve his function, and he knows nothing about society or, all he's got is this innate, I'm me and this is what I have to do. So he tends to speak in monosyllables. That is not what I do. I tend to speak in long paragraphs. So that's been difficult. I have to keep paring down his responses and thinking about how he would interact with people.
I don't know, starting a story where your main character's dead presents some problems.
Yeah, I've written those too.
No, it has been done.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, there was no sympathetic characters in the story.
Yeah.
Because the main character who was dead was, even though how nasty she was one of the nicer people.
I think the hardest time that I've had has been with characters whose profession or way of making a living is the harder one for me to understand. So people who do jobs that are far removed from, if I don't know people who do that job, because my way, I found the best way of getting into somebody's head is to try and think of someone who I know who reminds me of that person.
Just a comment. Getting out of the character, David Brennan, the uplifter, has chimpanzees interacting with humans, dolphins and orcas interacting with humans. It would be an interesting exercise to work on communicating with dolphins as an alien intelligence, because they truly are different and they do communicate. But how do we really don't understand. I mean, scientists certainly don't understand how to communicate with dolphins. They think, oh, they're nicely trained animals. They may be smarter than people. And they may have their own speech patterns. And so it'd be an interesting exercise to talk about solving that problem. How do you communicate with a truly alien species that exists in your same environment.
Something that I ran across in a couple of things that I've read recently, meaning like within the last 6 months, were two people who could read minds. And when I read it, I thought, no, I mean, I don't think that way. They were pulling out sentences, you know, you're thinking this, and they'd say a sentence, and how did you know? And I thought, I think more pictures and emotions and you know, Rocky Mountain type stuff, you know, than I do in actual paragraphs. I speak in paragraphs, but that's not how I think. You know, so I've been trying to think about how I would write someone who can see into someone else's mind and what they would really see. I mean, they're not going to see sentences, generally. I mean, you may think sentences on occasion.
I think in sentences all the time. It's like everything's like completely dominated by sentences. It's like this running narrative of everything I'm experiencing, and then I put it into words as it's going.
Oh, mine's like a movie with emotions in it.
Mine is words, and they tend to spew out my mouth too.
Yeah, people would have a mind reader, right? Might have trouble with my mind also, and there are other things. Some women would likely be disturbed by my sight to touch synesthesia.
I have a story. It was a storyteller named Reuben Gold. He lived in Chicago, and he came here, and he was telling his stories. And at the end of that, he sat down opposite a woman, and he held her hand. He managed to go through 20 minutes of asking her questions, and she always answered yes. It was unbelievable to watch it because she swore he was reading her mind because they were not obvious questions. It helped that he was a psychiatric social worker. He had a lot of experience doing that. So, well, he was a weird character as it was. He was a weird character. But, you know, it turns out the person who he was talking to had been a former nun who had fallen in love and was thinking about getting married. And this was at a synagogue, and how he ever got from one place to the other, it was just unbelievable. A group of us walked out of it, not believing it could have been possibly done, that he had to have some connection. And my wife's comment was that he was communicating with her not only on the verbal level, but by feeling the tension in her hands. He was holding her hands, the tension in her hands, the way her face looked. Some other cues that he was getting. And we haven't really talked about characters who get cues outside of what's going on. Because a lot of our communication, 50%, is nonverbal.
There's a book, and I don't remember the name, but it's about someone writing from an alien species point of view where they have 6 senses, I think, and the story's told from 6 different perspectives. The same story told over 6 times, from each one from a different perspective, from the same character. It was a writing exercise or something. So that'd be interesting to try.
Oh yeah, that'd be fun. I may have to do that.
You could do some research into that then by researching poker, because those people or readers, they train in that ability to read people's body language.
There was a long time ago a book called The Hidden Dimension, and that's about body language. It's probably out of print, but they've probably been superseded. It was one of the first books I saw that talked about reading people's body language.
There was also a TV show for 3 years called Lie to Me, about a specialist in reading body language. I don't know how accurate it is, but it's there.
I didn't think it had enough truth in it to be interesting.
I don't know about everything else, but I bet you anything that for people who study human character and that there probably are some cultural things that everybody who's lived in a convent does that you and I wouldn't notice, but that someone who is familiar with.
I thought about how there's a lot of people who can spot a cop when a cop walks in. If there are people who can spot an ex-nun.
My grandpa almost married a woman who used to be a nun. And, I mean, I'm not Catholic, so I don't know, but I've met a couple of nuns, and you know, they're a culture unto themselves, and so they must have attributes.
Well, there's a bit on Jay Leno that they used to do all the time with this guy that used to be on The Sopranos, and they put him on a street corner, and he'd point at a guy and say, that guy right there, he's been in town about 6 hours, his wife's been nagging at him the whole time, he wants to, you know, he just rattle off all this stuff. And he'd go up, just random people, he'd go up and talk to him and say, so your wife been bugging you all day? Yes, you know, just, I mean, it would just, everything that he would pick up from the guy's body cues and the way he walked and the way he interacted with people around him, he just could tell the whole guy's story, right, just from watching him from across the street.
Yeah, that's intuition taken by
No,
the max.
I don't think it's intuition, I think it's experience.
Well,
And learning.
right.
Maybe on a
It's
subconscious
trained
level.
intuition.
right.
You're both right. You have to,
I'm sure it's a blend, yeah.
spend all that time learning those things, but once you learn it like any other skill, once you really learn it, you stop
Yep.
thinking about it on a conscious level.
Well, we were talking about different characters and how they think.
Mm-hmm.
I read in a book that about how 21 people, I think it is, write different. It's 21 award-winning authors and how they come up with their stories and write, how to develop their plots and that sort of thing. And one said when she gets stuck, you know, about halfway through a book, I've found it works way before that, that she will write something that doesn't go in the book, it's just for her, but she writes where we're at right now from the viewpoint of all her main characters. And I did that during Nano, and wow, was that an eye-opener.
Then didn't that shift your story like
It did.
drastically?
Yep, and it moved it ahead really fast. So that I thought was a great exercise. It also helped me develop each of their voices, you know, so that they sounded different. They were very different, so they needed to sound very different.
Thinking about different characters and how they might think, and talking about aliens, I read a book called Usurper of the Sun by Kosuke Nojiri, and it's about this alien race comes and they're making a ring around the sun. We don't know why, and so we have trouble communicating with them. We send them, you know, it's a Japanese author, so they send them Japanese and English, and they try to communicate, you know, through colors and numbers, but nothing works. And then finally, this computer programmer or whatnot, he develops an AI that has no commonalities with humanity. So it perceives its world by itself. And that works because what happens is when they finally go and they reach the alien race that's building this ring around our sun and killing us, the alien race said, oh, we didn't even know you were talking to us. We couldn't perceive that. Like, we thought that you were all the same as us. They didn't have the perception of telling humans apart from themselves for some reason. I didn't understand fully what all the reasons were. I had to reread certain parts of it, but I think it goes along very well with what we're talking about. And for me, that was a very, very interesting read in the sense that I didn't understand the aliens at all, and I had to reread different parts of the book just to get what they were talking about. So if you're interested, the book's called Usurper of the Sun, but it was very eye-opening for me that, you know, they can be so different and just not even perceive the same things that we perceive in any way.
Yeah.
Were the aliens visible?
They were. Yep. They, I think that they looked like big caterpillars or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but yeah, they were visible. They could see, and one of the comments that the aliens made was, I guess they were highly, highly intelligent. And I won't give away anything else about the book, but they instantly perceived how humans, like once they understood that we were separate from them, they instantly perceived that we like to use our eyes, was one of the comments that I really liked. They're like, oh, you humans like to use your eyes. They got it right away, I guess, because everything is visual for
As
us.
sense organs, or?
Oh, I don't know. It's just, we like to That's the line that I remember is, oh, you humans like to use your eyes. But,
Which makes sense.
But I thought that it was interesting.
They're primary, not secondary, in other words.
Yeah,
Or
well, we
tertiary.
do go around looking at stuff. Most of us don't touch absolutely everything, and you know, probably try and smell the things we want to smell and not smell.
So you could go to a situation, we develop visual senses because humans developed on a savanna of some sort and had to be able to see long distances. And we're bipedal because we had to run down stuff. But you can imagine a different type of world with a different type of environment. You know, like, what was it, Hal Clemens' Flatland? Not Flatland. Hal Clemens' Mission of Gravity, where everything's very high gravity and everything lives on a plane, and they don't have this far eyesight because it's of no value in their development. And so they're going to perceive the world differently than we perceive the world.
As a matter of fact, Flatland would be
And that's another
a relevant book too.
Right, for
Flatland.
perception, yeah.
By Abbott.
There's also a book called The Planiverse by A.K. Dudney, in which a computer programming class makes contact with a two-dimensional world.
What's it called?
The Planiverse. A.K. Dudney. D-E-W-D-N-E-Y.
All right, I have a question. So suppose you did have to write about an alien that like communicates by radio instead of visible light or something. That was one of the questions that was on the meeting announcement. How would you get the metaphor to work for a human reader using the English language?
Very difficult.
First, you have to
Yes.
world build enough that you understood what you're talking about in the first place. You know, you wouldn't dare go into that undeveloped.
Well, I'm going to go back to developing sound in air, sound in water. Dolphins and whales communicate on different spectra than we do because we speak, but it's going through air, and the electromagnetic spectrum works in air. With sound compression, it doesn't work necessarily underwater. And so they have to communicate differently. We have those examples. You know, like how do you communicate in a different media? And I don't know if you know, that question you've asked has been asked many times in science fiction, but I don't think there's any real significant answer. You know, you have to observe that it's out there, and you have to observe that there's a difference.
And in the case of dolphins, we're doing a really bad job at understanding them. Nobody's ever cracked the language and figured out what they're actually talking about.
They're talking about us.
So long and thanks for all the
The way they get quiet
Yeah.
every time we
Well,
enter
I
the
think-
room, yeah.
I think where I come from, if I was writing based on characters that communicated through radio waves, is I would try to think of, well, what human senses are that closest to? And I would probably think touch and hearing. And so I would try and use that as a metaphor when I was writing out how my aliens communicate.
Well, and that's kind of like on frequencies, so I would think of it as, you know, sometimes when you walk into a room where you get static shock and your hair stands on end. So, I don't know, I think that it would have to do something with that. I think that you could really tie that in, especially through touch, how it could, you know, the goosebumps you get and maybe the cold sensations and different things like that could really relate into just different words.
Showing repercussions of how that affects their culture. They'd avoid lead because it blocks their communications, right? They'd have almost an allergic reaction or something. Showing how because they're communicating this different way, it wouldn't just be in communication, it would affect their whole culture. If you can show that, you know, so there's other ways to show it, how it affects them, how it gives them benefits and drawbacks to their society.
Or
think about the organs of sense too for that. I mean, I imagine they'd have to have some sort of physiological equivalent to an antenna to pick up larger wavelengths. So you might describe some of them by the way different wavelengths feel to that sensory organ. I mean, like really big wavelengths. I can't remember my magnetic spectrum very well at the moment, but you know, really big wavelengths might vibrate more strongly at the base of your antenna, sort of like the way really deep sounds kind of rumble in your chest and in your belly instead of just in your ears.
Or they might feel redder instead of bluer.
Yeah.
Yeah, or let's see, Hal Clement in one novel said by the way, that apparently, and one thing that in translating between different species, that nobody even tried translating color names.
Color names?
Because because as of the differences, and because or the differences in what people see and what different kinds of beings see.
So you mean that science fiction writers generally don't bother?
No, I mean that Hal Clement was saying that in the background of this book that intelligent beings don't bother because it's too difficult. I mean,
No, I don't know if it's too difficult, or what you're doing with it's concrete objects, or concrete thing, and then you simply have to point to it and say its name, and the other character will point to it and say its name, and then you have a correspondence. But
Which
there's
is how
no
Helen Keller learned to communicate.
Right, but there's no translation because it's simply a one-to-one correspondence, like a correspondence table, and you would then translate through a translation or correspondence table.
maybe, and I
But you don't
remember.
need.
But that would be good enough to give a reader a vicarious experience.
Right.
By the way, something that I've been thinking about, or I've thought about from time to time, which is with a human society in which people ordinarily communicate with sign language, and only the blind speak. How different would the thinking be?
There actually is a village, I think it's somewhere in the Middle East, where most of the people there have a hereditary form of hearing loss. So they developed a natural language of sign language. So it's not like ASL, which was like sort of invented, but so, and most of the people who live there know it.
And there's that story by H.G. Wells, is it The Empire of the Blind?
The Country of the Blind.
Yes.
They were, but there's, it's also, also Nantucket Island in New England, there was a high degree of hereditary and deafness, and people developed, and there was a local sign language that most people there knew.
So again, it gets back to setting.
What?
Again, it gets back to setting. Establishing the setting,
Context,
developing the role of context.
And of course,
There's a John Varley story that I think is, I don't remember if it was called The Country of the Blind, but there's a John Varley story about a community of people who were all blind and deaf and very tactile. I forget the name of the story.
I know the story and I can't remember it either.
Elizabeth Hayden, science fiction writer, poetry. She has women who tell what's going on by knots on sleeves, because all the women are blinded when they become of age, except for those who are in illegal professions And there, the greatest curse is to say, I see you.
Let's see, okay, that's Suzanne Hayden.
Suzanne Hayden.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember the title, but that's
I
one
don't
of the
think-
novels.
Oh,
Susanna Hazlitt Hayden, something
Yeah.
like that. And she emphasizes communication because that's what she did professionally.
Are you talking about Suzette Hayden Elgin?
Yes, Suzanne Hayden.
Okay, she, the only books of hers I know of
She was
were
a
about,
linguist.
about a group of linguists.
She writes in a book on poetry that she wrote novels so she could put her poetry in it. And she has authored the science fiction handbook of science fiction poetry, which is different than what your English professors write about poetry. It's from a linguist's viewpoint.
Something that I just looked up because I couldn't remember the name was people who have, like most people are trichromats, have got 3 kinds of cones
Yeah.
in their eyes, and animals, a lot of them are dichromats, they only have 2. There are people they found out now that are all women, as far as I know. There might be some men who are tetrachromats. They have 4 cones, they see way more colors than anybody else does. And that impacts them in a lot of ways because they see, sometimes they can look at a sunset and tell exactly what the weather's going to be like, where most people can't, and because they don't see the same colors. And that has been, I've been wanting to write a story about
Yeah,
that.
I've read about that. They have to be women because one of the
Is that it?
genes for seeing color is on the
It's on
X
the X
chromosome, and they
chromosome.
have,
Which is why more men are
one,
colorblind.
yeah, so they have one copy on one X chromosome and a slightly
Okay.
different copy on the other chromosome,
Okay.
and that's where the extra one comes from.
Yeah, their spectrum of vision is like enormously more than ours.
Right, and we don't see any infrared. And we
Right.
don't see whatever the infrared is.
Ultraviolet.
Ultraviolet, yeah.
except, let's see, people who had had cataract surgery used to be able to see near ultraviolet afterwards, but now
Really?
apparently the lenses are made to filter out ultraviolet. The the contact lenses,
Yeah, it probably
That
wouldn't
sounds
be
like a
good
good
for you
idea.
letting all that UV in there.
Yeah, actually, my wife had cataract surgery. She's just glad she can see. Like, oh, you mean the middle light is really yellow? And then instead of everything sort of fading out.
I know that insects often see in ultraviolet, and some birds.
And bees, I think.
Yeah,
Yes.
so I said
Like insects, right.
There's a
There's
book.
bees, butterflies, moths. So some of there's some species where you wonder how the sexes tell each other apart, and some of the ones that can see in UV, once you look at them in UV, you realize that there's a pattern that they're seeing that we just don't normally see.
There's a book called Empire of the Ants. I forget the author. Basically, it's Watership Down for ants. Yeah, they communicate via pheromones, I think it is.
I think the aliens in the Alien franchise communicate by thermal patterns on their forehead. It's never brought up in any of the movies, but
Oh, that's
I think
interesting.
I've read that.
yeah.
Is it from
Somewhere
the
back there.
novelization?
And I
No,
don't
it's
know-
actually from the role-playing game.
I don't know how
It's amazing where you can learn
No,
things.
I don't know
They
how
got that
realistic this
information.
is, but there's this episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation where they come across this alien race. The translator microbes or whatever the heck they use. They speak English, but they only speak in phrases like Dormak and Jalarda
Oh, yes.
Tanagra. And they
Oh,
speak in metaphors from their
Yes.
yeah, that's a
oral
weird
history, sort of
episode.
As the wall fell, right? Isn't that like?
Yeah.
Dawag
But- and-
at Tanagra, his arms open wide.
Yeah.
Shaka when the walls fell, but
Yeah.
things like that.
Yes, and it was a
One of the better
really
examples
interesting
of
episode.
Actual first contact.
I don't know how
with
realistic
things I
that would be,
thought.
When we speak, when we write, about 50% of our speech and language and our writing is idiomatic. My wife had me analyze stories told by people in nursing homes, and she wondered if this certified nursing assistants from a different country would have trouble understanding it. And we concluded, yeah, you could come up with all sorts of lessons because about 50% of their normal, that were recorded and transcribed, 50% of their normal speech was idiomatic. And we would have not really perceived it, but you had to look for specific idiomatic usage.
But is this just English, or is this any language?
I don't know, these were people in an American nursing home.
If you study Latin, half of it's idioms and it has to be explained.
Yeah, I think it's
the
natural
context,
for
cultural
people with
context is completely
language to
changed.
create idioms.
Yeah, that's the trouble with taking the Bible literally.
Yeah, I
a certain amount of it is idiomatic usage.
Because that would be an interesting historical issue if you have to write a story that takes place before 1500 or so. We've stolen so much from Shakespeare.
Right.
Writing a character from before then would think in a very different way.
They speak differently.
Well, yeah.
Yes, you'd need a translator.
One of the useful things to know when you're like thinking of European characters pre-Renaissance is look up old religious allegories because more people understood visual allegories than knew how to read, and it usually explains a lot of the weird little things that turn up in art from the time. You can also bestiaries from that time explain, what the significance of different animals were to people. And part of it was based on fact and part of it was based on fable. That, like people thinking of lions as brave and, hyenas as nasty and snakes as evil. These are all based on parables or fables about the creature.
You can go back to Shakespeare. There are productions of Shakespeare in the original accent. Well, when you go through that, you can Google that and find some stuff in open culture. And there are puns in there. There are rhymes in there that you don't notice if you use current pronunciation because their pronunciation was so different. And there's slang in his titles, like All About Nothing is a slang title. And I'll let you figure out what it is about. But if people knew, they wouldn't be taught in school.
By the way, I once read a collection of Shakespeare criticism from over decades and centuries, and after a while I realized that I was learning more about the times in which the critics wrote than about Shakespeare. When I mentioned this to Pamela Dean, who has a degree in English, she did not seem surprised for some reason.
I had a question about our topic. Are there any children's books or stories where they have, aliens or maybe just, mystical creatures, I guess, that perceive things much differently than we do? And how did they make those characters interesting to children?
Children's books.
Where the wild things are.
Which
I'm
one?
looking for a little bit more detail than where the wild things are. I know what you mean. That's a good one.
A Wrinkle in Time.
A Wrinkle in Time
Oh, the first
I
one.
haven't read it.
is a wonderful kid story about a couple of kids who meet an alien who lives in at least 4 dimensions, and there's
Okay.
all sorts of funky stuff going on.
Okay.
It's also a very good book.
Stuff by Susan D. Cooper.
Because I feel like writing these characters to make them relatable and interesting and easy read is my most difficult part.
Diana Wynne Jones has a book, Dog's Body, where Sirius the dog star turns into an actual human dog. So you get kind of a double whammy there.
Okay.
There's
what's the name of
Dog's Body, and it's Diana Wynne Jones.
Dog's Body?
there is let's see, I forget who it was who said that the difference between writing for adults and writing for children is that writing for children, you have to write better.
Yeah, that's why I asked that
Yeah.
question.
But of course,
Because children, you need to be able to be very, very entertaining and very, you know,
They'll give
very
you no
precise.
mercy.
Yeah, they'll give you no mercy. They're just going to put the book down.
There was an author, and I don't remember his name, he died last year. He said when he writes stuff and he revises, he takes out all the uninteresting stuff.
That's the point, isn't it?
okay, and of course, what's interesting and what isn't very is I remember reading a version of Casanova's memoirs where the editor, it was abridged, but the editor had taken out a whole lot of the dull stuff about sex so that people could concentrate on stuff like the political and the political explanations.
Or was that just his excuse?
No,
Maybe the editor was just trying to censor it.
No, well, I don't know. I think the editor really did. I don't know. I had the impression the editor really did think that the sex stuff was the dull stuff.
It could be the editor's concept of the book was
I don't
not
think
the
I'd
same as
be
the
buying
writer's.
much from that person's
What?
stable of writers.
Well,
If that's an editor.
Well, sex can be dull if done incorrectly.
oh yeah, oh yes, oh yes, there is. It is amazing. It is amazing. And I read.
To put it this way, if it's dull, you're not doing it right.
Yeah, but I mean it's.
Same with writing.
No,
I've met people. I've met people whose speaking style can render the topic of sex boring. But that's different than actually.
But yeah, but the I read enough amateur erotic stories to know just how dull sex can be written. And by the way, it is, and it certainly shows how by the way, how differently people write, because there's some writers who describe their characters by giving their physical statistics. The character is such and such is so many feet and inches tall.
Then you gotta write the rest of your story that way, like Raymond Chandler.
What?
If you're like writing like Raymond Chandler, you put in all those details. So it's to the extent that everything is detailed and you understand exactly what's going on. If you're just describing your characters that way, it doesn't work.
Yeah, but I mean it is. Yeah, but the thing is that these people, as far as I can tell, do not realize there are other people who visualize characters rather than rather than seeing reading descriptions.
So the author sees his characters as collections of stats.
Yeah, and
like in Dungeons and Dragons.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I avoid describing my characters, actually.
We have to describe them some.
Okay.
Yeah, so that like they're taller, they have this hair color or that hair color.
But okay. People can be described by the way they move, or
Yeah.
among other things.
Yeah, you can recognize people by the way they move without actually seeing much of them. It depends on how you recognize things.
I have a question for you. You went right to describing their hair right away, so you recognize people through hair. Do you often find yourself writing about hair?
Well, not about just.
Or do
I
you-
don't go into like great detail, but it's like, oh, you know, a blonde man walked into the room, and like,
Sure,
oh, that's how you know who he is. It's the blonde man with the short blonde hair.
But how does that reflect his personality?
The hair color usually
he has
doesn't have
short
anything to do with
blonde hair, obviously, he's a
personality.
Nazi.
That's a bad driver.
You know, we have stereotypes that we, you know, so.
Speaking of which.
Actually, let's see, people who dye their hair, that has, and what hair color they choose might have something to do with their personality.
So, do you, when you're
I don't worry.
in dialogue with somebody, do you watch people's facial expressions?
Yeah, because I can tell expressions. I just can't tell how one person's face is different from another person.
Oh, okay, so it's the...
So it's like everybody's Barbie.
Oh,
That's not. I don't mean anything bad about.
Thank you.
There's a particularly designed to recognize the darkness.
Yeah, so it's like everybody else in the world has a magical power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you find that
really
difficult?
disconcerting.
then?
Oh,
Like
yes.
When you're writing descriptions of your characters or people that are just walking into the scene, I mean, when you look at people around you and you see everyone as the same essentially, especially when first meeting them, do you find that coming through when you write?
Actually, you can take advantage of it because I have so many compensating mechanisms. I pay attention to the way people move and what their voices sound like and what their hair looks like and what they wear. So you can use all of those other things.
That would actually be a real benefit. I could definitely see that. Because then you really know what to put to get the reader to see the character.
Yeah, so the thing I talked about before, memorizing like a whole room of people, their names. And the person who was doing that was Harry Lorraine, and he wrote a book called The Memory Book. And he has about 5 or 6 different memory systems in it. And he would memorize, you know, he'd greet everybody at the door coming into his lecture. And he would remember, at least for the length of the time of the lecture, everybody's name, first and last name. And then he would call on them during the lecture by name. There's a room of 500 or 600 people. And he was really good at it. The one exercise he gives is remembering all the states and their capitals. And it's easier to do in alphabetical order. But he shows you how to do it.
The states or the capitals?
The states and the capitals.
Yeah.
I mentioned it would be easier because then you could attach them to each other.
Right, yeah, so he basically comes up with telling a story that you can remember, and it's a fantastical story that you then create. And that's the same thing for remembering names. You take one of their features and you exaggerate it verbally in your memory, and you remember the person by the exaggerated story about their face or their walk or whatever, and that's how you remember them, rather than actually remembering the name. So the exaggeration becomes the cue for remembering what the person is or the object is. And you can do that for speeches by remembering the old Greek thing on one hand and on the other hand. It's called a method of rooms. So you would associate a certain idea with a room in your house. Because it's hard to memorize speeches.
Yeah, but then you attach it to something that's very familiar to you.
Right. And I haven't seen too many stories that actually use that method, explaining how someone navigates through the world.
It would be fun to write a story from the point of view of a professional memorist who goes around and does this, and he explains how he does it. I really like The Beautiful Mind for that very reason. He's a math guy. He doesn't memorize things, but at least the movie, they do it metaphorically enough that you sort of get the idea of what's going on in John Nash's mind while he's doing his theorem.
There's a movie called Memento where the person has no long-term memory, only short-term, and the movie steps backward in like 10-minute increments or something. It's genius. It's really, really well done.
Yep.
That you feel like this guy, you're only experiencing the story. a little bit at a time.
I hated that movie for that very reason.
Oh,
it drove me crazy because for me, I'm a big picture kind of person.
Me too. It's very
And
disorienting.
seeing things from that close up, I couldn't do it. It just kept confusing me.
He would
It
take
left me
pictures
lost.
of things with one of those cameras where the photo spit out the front.
Yeah.
And he'd wait for it and he'd write notes on it to himself so he could remember what happened.
Gene Wolfe wrote a series of stories, and I do not remember the name.
Let's see, Soldier of...
Soldier of the Mist.
Ah, okay.
And the person, perhaps to be a demigod, who just spice things up, cannot remember from day to day. And it talks about, in a story, someone finding this scroll rolled up with very small text written in Greek describing the person's life day by day, because the next day he would forget. The next day was new. He only knew what happened by rereading what he wrote. And it's very interesting. It's a very interesting scheme to say, all I'm doing is translating the scroll.
That was done on a lighter note with
51st
dates. Exactly.
Much lighter. I don't know whatever happened to him, but there was some guy in I think it was a Nova special, some guy named Clive who had brain damage, who would have to every day wake up and like be told his entire life. The one thing, the two things that were constants in his life is that he loved his wife even when he didn't know who she was right away, and he could play music because that part of his brain retained that.
Because
He played piano.
music only depends on half of his brain.
One of the things I was really impressed with in Soldier of the Mist is how he shows relationships developing between the protagonist and other characters, even though, I mean, the protagonist will know that he's having an emotional reaction to this person, but he won't know why. He shows, you know, the emotional relationship between the characters developing even in spite of the viewpoint voice not remembering the people from day to day.
One thing I'd like to get back to, kind of go full circle before you finish. At the very beginning, you said that you didn't feel, it doesn't feel strange from the inside. And you said you feel strange all the time. And I was thinking about the difference between that is that you were kind of coming from a personal viewpoint, you know, in yourself, not a social viewpoint. You were more, I would think, a social, how you feel socially. You feel different from other people, but that's something that you learned, not something that you are. So I just wanted to point out the perception difference, you know, that I heard when you both said that.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Okay. Usually there is a break at half past for people to to get something as munchies or whatever before the workshop. But so